Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Benjamin Kletzer from UC San Diego's History Ph.D. program to talk about the development of China's railways during the Maoist era and its impacts, both past and present. Ben, thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's just jump into the meat of your questions here. You talk about the construction of railroads and trains during the Maoist era, which was from 1949 to 1976. And I guess I want to start by laying the foundation for the context. What was going on in Maoist China that really encouraged these construction workers and these engineers to focus so heavily on building railways in China at this time?
So to step back, I think it's really important to understand that China was a latecomer in industrialization and also economic modernization in general, and all types of industrialization. And with that, a really latecomer in railroads. So, for example, the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, you could only travel to less than half of the provinces in China by train. So most of the country was inaccessible by train and by road, and for a large extent by river as well. And so the construction of railroads in Maoist China was really the fulfillment of goals that had been established by prior regimes, the Qing dynasty early on, and then later Sun Yat-sen and the short-lived Republican era in Chinese history. And so the key piece of this was that railroads were seen as incredibly important for all of the goals of a nation. Similar to the United States, where the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was seen as linking the two coasts of the United States and the interior to establish control over the interior and unify the country. Railroads were seen as achieving the greater goals of nation building in China. And in those goals, the key ones were unifying the nation, so establishing political control and unifying the country, establishing national sovereignty, right? So China had been invaded numerous times, most recently in 1937 by Japan. And so railroads are seen as part of establishing national borders and sovereignty that can be enforced. And then finally, and maybe almost most importantly, railroads are seen as the fundamental infrastructure for economic development, right? Worldwide, we see that. And so building railroads to link cities and countryside, cities to ports, was really big in establishing the base for any type of economic development. And so in Maoist China, given the lack of railroads and lack of prior railroad construction, railroads were highly prioritized. Building into the interior of China, building between industrial areas to new ports, and really linking centuries-old cities to each other in connections that had never existed before in Chinese history. And this established, the basics like travel from Beijing to Shanghai was possible on a greater scale during Maoist China because of the many of these construction projects.
Mm-hmm. And one important aspect of your research that you bring up is that railroads were initially in China a tool for the colonizers. And then during the Maoist period, um, uh, it became a tool for, like you said, economic development and promotion of the nation state. And I want to know um, who exactly were the people who were constructing these railways in China during this time, and where did they learn the skills to develop these trains and railways? Was it from working with the colonizers during the period of colonialism in China, or did they go study abroad, or where did they develop these skills to learn how to construct and maintain this infrastructure?
So that question is really key to my research because in 1949, when the China National Railways was established, the group of engineers and managers who led the railroads was composed of people with various educational backgrounds. Very few of them were educated by colonial powers. The major colonial power in railroad construction was Japan in Manchuria. And they, similar to the United States in the 19th century and early 20th century, and apartheid South Africa, Japan had racial regulations on who could be an engineer. And those prohibited, these racist regulations prohibited Chinese education, unfortunately. So what you have is less people educated by the colonial powers, and instead the vast majority of engineers were educated by abroad or in institutions established by the Republican government. The biggest group of people who would be decision makers were actually educated in the United States at universities in the United States, and then trained by American railroads through these very advanced internships that unfortunately, these tight ties between America and Chinese industry have yet to be really studied. But they were well documented in the 1940s when China was an ally of the United States. And these engineers educated in the United States returned to China to help run the railroads. They were then joined by native engineers trained in Chinese universities. And then the final group were engineers who were trained by Soviet technicians, by Soviet engineers. So you have people trained by the Soviets, people trained by American engineers, and people trained internally who then all go in and starting in 1949, form new educational institutions to train the next generation.
Mm-hmm. I want to quote you here. So you talk about the construction of railways in China as, quote, prioritizing expertise over political correctness, professionalism over politics, and conventional technology over socialist science. Can you dive a little bit deeper into what you mean by this and what significance this has in your research?
So to step back and give more perspective, the traditional history of Maoist China, right, enforces a lot of these moments where someone's political loyalty, political position in the Communist Party, what they called quote unquote being red, right, in communist, was prioritized over being expert. So there was this tension between red versus expert, foreign trained, which would be the experts, versus loyal Communist Party member with revolutionary who had been with Mao since they were on the Long March or in Yan'an. And that on the railroads, the political loyalty and these true communist credentials were deprioritized in favor of educational background. So if you were well educated, you and a competent manager and engineer, you tended to be promoted and high up in the decision making arena, whereas in numerous other industries, experts were pushed aside in favor of people who had political connections. And in railroading, that doesn't happen, which kind of is an aberration in what we currently see in communist China, where political loyalty is prioritized over expertise. Similar with conventional technology over socialist science. There was this big debate that's part of this red versus expert idea, where in native Chinese inventions done by working class or loyal Communist Party members was prioritized over imported technology, right? So something invented in China by someone who's valued by Mao and by the Communist Party must be better than an imported technology. And on the railroads, almost all their technology is imported. Like the short-lived ideas that are developed internally by loyal Communist Party members who are not trained mechanical engineers are shunted aside in favor of Western technology at each juncture. And this is very different than in agriculture, where agricultural innovations the party intentionally prioritized native developments and really nationalistic ideas over imported foreign ideas.
Do you have an assessment as to why railroads were an exception to this rule?
The biggest, and this really gets to the point, is that the fundamental reason why railroads are the exception to the rule is the importance of the railroads, right? That the railroads are so important to every goal of the Communist Party. And by every goal, I mean politically, economically, militarily, and ideologically, right? Politically, they need the railroads to control and unify the country. Economically, they need the railroads to build and develop the country. Militarily, they need the railroads to enforce sovereignty. And ideologically, the railroads transmit propaganda. So, the railroads, because they're so important, the Communist Party cannot afford to disrupt that operation, right? Disrupting that operation through various means would stymie all of those goals. So instead, the railroads their importance allows them to have this tremendous flexibility and all of these exceptions, because as long as they continue running and achieving and helping the Communist Party achieve these goals, then they're fulfilling their role in the communist state.
So you talk about various technological and economic exchanges between the USSR and the PRC, and you mentioned it a little bit in talking about how people from the USSR were responsible for training some some of these people in the PRC who were constructing and maintaining these railroads and trains. I wonder if there were any other contributions by the USSR that maybe you haven't mentioned yet And I also wonder if Mao's falling out with Khrushchev had an impact on this exchange in any way.
Yes. So the there were this was the Sino-Soviet technological exchange was the biggest technology transfer in human history to date. And on the railroads, it was huge because it allowed China to get modern locomotive and railway technology. Um, and so what it did is they got the basis for technology that these railroad engineers had learned about in education, and then could build off of to innovate Chinese designs that are an improvement of the Soviet designs. And this technology was incredibly varied, from signals, basically stoplights for trains to direct traffic, to locomotives, to railway bridges. Right, everything was open for China to absorb from the Soviet Union. What happened though is that the falling out between Mao and Khrushchev happened at a time when China was particularly absorbing internal combustion and electric locomotive technologies from the Soviet Union. And that paused that development, so that China actually looked to other countries and other means for developing those technologies. And instead of directly copying Soviet technology, like the first Chinese electric railway was, they then actually had to innovate and look around the world for other technologies and other ideas that ended up building the base for Chinese native innovations in that technology. So the Sino-Soviet split did come at a point where it stopped certain technology transfers, but it also came after a point where they received a significant amount of technology transfer.
So my next question here is sort of a two-parter. In the first part of which is, what is the legacy of these railroad constructions during the Maoist period? Of course, you and I have both been to China, and we've been on the high-speed rail, and I was certainly enamored by just the grand scale of this construction. Is there a certain way that this early railroad construction during the Maoist period is talked about in China today, or just how that legacy is seen and understood now?
So, first off, to answer the first part, the legacy is tremendous because this built the entire base for modern Chinese railroads, right? Like China's railways today are very much a creation of the Maoist era in terms of the way they're managed, in prioritizing technical expertise, and these it's very much run by managers and engineers who are mechanically and technically trained. The fundamentally, right, China's ties between provinces are still based on railroads built in this period, because of course railroads built in 1960 were built using modern technology that is very functional today compared to the 100-year-old infrastructure that America runs its fastest trains on. Like, these China's slowest trains are more modern technology. And then the basis of actually building this railway into this very large institutional structure that has its own universities, schools, housing, supply industry. So they build everything themselves, right? was the base to then build high-speed rail, right? They have all these factories, all this knowledge, so that injecting different types of knowledge in terms of building high-speed trains was quite easy, because the same factories that they built steam locomotives in have now been rebuilt to build high-speed trains because they have that infrastructure. So that infrastructural base was crucial for high-speed rail, because they have the knowledge base to build now a high-speed railway network that's 22,000 kilometers, like, which, compared to 0 kilometers in the United States of equivalent high-speed rail. And so that legacy lives on in all of China's current railway development, because it's built on the structures formed by railroaders during the Mao era. The legacy in China is more complicated. For a very, very long time, China's focus in terms of internal discussions has been on the high-speed train, right? And that old steam trains, older technology is just old, and it's a symbol of old Maoist China. Now it's becoming, they're starting to have industrial history parks and industrial history museums where one can go experience, the Maoist China's railways. But it's all understood as this like very proud heritage through the lens of both building the economic infrastructure for China's market economy takeoff that, of course, relies on the railroads too. But then the second part is that it's done very much in the lens of the Communist Party's traditional history of China, where China suffered this century of humiliation at foreign powers, and the Communist Party led China to stand up and form this independent, strong nation. And part of that was the Communist Party gallantly led the railroads into an era of modern construction and everything. And so histories in China take really what I'm studying and add on to it that this would have only been possible with the leadership of the Communist Party of China. And so railroads then fit into their messaging very neatly, because on the railroads, they did have these tremendous successes in the People's Republic of China and Mao era. So by saying that this was only possible under the Communist Party, it plays into their power and their messaging.
Mm-hmm. And following up from what we just talked about, to bring it to an American audience in a different way, since that's who most of my listeners are. I remember back in, I think it was 2018, the state government of California was excited about this plan to build a high-speed rail from, I think, San Francisco to LA or something like that. And they were hailing this as this big, technological innovation. But, I thought it was kind of funny because, of course, you look at East Asia, you look at Japan, Taiwan, China, for example, who have already built these grand webs of high-speed rail and subway systems. What, on a practical level, can Americans here take away from the history of railways in China? What lessons can be learned and ideally applied here in some way?
So the biggest thing is I would um, in China and the United States have a really core parallel, which is the railroads in both countries. Still, the primary emphasis has always been freight transportation, right? And so the United States freight railroads are second to none. We carry more tonnage at higher speeds and better and greater efficiency than any country in the world, right? The idea that a UPS package that gets to your house can be loaded on a train in New York and get to Los Angeles in 4 days is unbelievable around the world, but it's done daily in the United States. And China's railroads, the big push for a high-speed railway between Beijing and Shanghai wasn't just transporting people faster between Beijing and Shanghai. It was taking passenger trains off of the railway so that they could run more freight trains. And that's, I think, the lesson in the United States is twofold. One is understanding that building passenger railway infrastructure has huge benefits across society, right? Environmental, egalitarian, right? Allowing people of different backgrounds to get places. That car transportation creates these huge inequalities. But moreover, the economic benefits are huge because it does free up space for greater economic freight transportation, right? And so the biggest thing that the United States could do to develop passenger railway infrastructure is purely investment. The original plan under Biden for investment in Amtrak is quite ambitious, and that would be the first step into building high-speed trains around the United States, which is simply building higher speed trains between cities. China did not build high-speed rail in one step. China had a 20-year period of just making passenger trains faster. And we haven't done any of that yet in the United States, except in a few places. And with heavy investment, the United States could build that. And of course, that investment, as China's experienced, stimulates a huge economic boom because of the construction industry, right? All of this stuff would be built in the United States. All of the trains would be built in the United States. All of the infrastructure, of course, is built in the United States. And in China, it's employed a workforce of millions of people, which would be similar in the United States. So I mean, the key ingredient really is massive investment.
Mm-hmm. And so my last question here is, if someone is listening to this and they're really interested in knowing more about trains in China or just the railway construction of the railway system, would there be one or two books that you could recommend that they go pick up?
So unfortunately, there actually is a real lack of existing books on Chinese railways. The current book that I would recommend is Railroads and the Transformation of China by Elizabeth Cole. Professor Cole's book is the first major history on Chinese railways. And her book covers from the early years of the railways in China to today. And so that would be the first book I would recommend, Railroads in the Transformation of China by Elizabeth Cole. Other than Professor Cole's book, there actually is no other existing books. So I would recommend, waiting, I guess, till I publish my work. But it's one of the main things that stimulated this project was the lack of work in the field. And Professor Cole's book is a major part of the foundation of my work, and I build off of her argument and her findings and use that as the baseline for my work, and she has been tremendously helpful for my work. But outside of that, there really is very, very little. And this is in sharp contrast to other nations where, like, Japanese railroads have been documented. There's multiple books now out on even high-speed trains in Japan. Of course, in the American history and European history, there's plenty of books on railroads. But China, the absence is quite notable.
Well, Ben, thank you for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And for those in the audience that want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or visit NakotaDefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.